Hey guys, there's a few topics I can talk about off the top of my head just from memory. For instance, if I wanted to talk about Wikipedia and its propaganda, I could point out how Wikipedia breaks down the evolution of the parties in a very strange way. For example, for the Democrat Party, it only shows like a three-step process where it goes from anti-federalist, federalist, excuse me, to Democratic Republican Party, and then goes to the Democrat Party. Whereas it shows the evolution of the Republican Party as being very convoluted, having a lot of steps, a lot of breakoffs, a lot of like issues with the way that they eventually formed, and it is like a bit of propaganda because it kind of gives the impression that the Republican Party came about as an accident, that there wasn't like a uh, that they had been struggling for decades, if not centuries, to form a cohesive unit, which really is not the case. Because if you do more research into it, you'll see that the Democrat Party has been around for quite a while, but it has had many times in the past had parties split off from it, showing that it has been a very derisive company. Derisive company, derisive party, divisive party for quite a while. Where like other parties will just split off from it and hardly ever come back into the fold. Eventually, they'll dissolve many of these parties, but like the Alliance Party, for example, is part of it. But the Alliance Party has candidates that ran as both Republicans and Democrat. But then you have like Andrew Yang's party, the Forward Party. And then there's other parties that I can mention, like the War Democrats, for example, which was around a civil war, I believe. Other things I can talk about is how the RINO faction of the Republican Party came around. Now, if you're not aware, RINO stands for Republican in name only. Now, originally, what had happened is that the Republicans weren't doing all that well, in very similar fashion to what happened with Trump. They weren't putting forward good candidates. So eventually, uh, Ronald Reagan ran for the party. Now, he originally became governor of California, which is usually a good stepping stone to become a presidential candidate because California has such a high population and has so many votes in the electoral college that if you can guarantee getting that state to vote for you, it's a pretty good way to become president. And at the time, California was actually a red state. Now it definitely isn't any longer, but at the time, yeah, it would definitely be vote mostly for Republicans. That's also around the time that Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor. It had already started to turn blue pretty heavily, and then it would turn blue almost completely after he got out of office. Now, the way that it actually turned blue, just as a little aside, is that Ronald Reagan had a lot of liberal views. He didn't like, but he also had a lot of conservative views. So, like, he didn't like the drug trade that was going on, and his wife especially pushed for the war on drugs, which led to a whole bunch of different issues. Now, I would partially agree with it because we've seen them try to legalize all drugs in California, and it's only led to very bad things to happen. So I wouldn't say that stopping the war on drugs the way that they tried actually was a good idea. But the war on drugs definitely didn't solve much of the issues. Like, they didn't go after the source. Excuse me. So, the war on drugs, yeah, definitely a mistake that they made. But another mistake that Ronald Reagan made was that he gave general amnesty to all illegals inside the country, allowing them to eventually get some kind of pathway to citizenship. This is what turned California blue, because a lot of those people really relied on the government paycheck, and I mentioned that before. Now, why I say that Ronald Reagan was a RINO in name only is that he wasn't really the type of politician that always supported the Republican Party. The reason the Republicans voted for him is because he was vastly different from the actual normal Republican candidate. So he kind of only went for populist views. And as a very religious man, or at least semi-religious, he really showed. He was also very polite. How religious he actually was is kind of unknown, because he made the excuse that he wouldn't go to church because he was afraid that if he had gone to church very often, that it would make the entire church a target for assassinations. And it would endanger the lives of the people in the congressional. Which kind of makes sense. After all, he was shot at one point. I believe that was Sirhan, if I'm recalling correctly. But the point is that a lot of people didn't think that he was nearly as religious as he tried to make himself out to be. And while he was a very friendly individual, always trying to tell stories and such, he even got, I think it was McGovern, to laugh during a debate by making a joke about his age, saying that despite the fact that he is so old, he'll never hold against his opponent's youth against him during the debate, and that made McGovern laugh, if I recall. But again, like I said, while he was a very vast change from the Republican standard at the time, there were a lot of liberal views that he held. Republicans are completely okay with legal immigration, but Ronald Reagan was okay with illegal immigration and then gave them mass amnesty, which, again, since those people relied on a government paycheck, and Democrats are the ones who always push for government benefits, that basically all those illegal immigrants who eventually became citizens wanted the Democrats in order to keep getting that paycheck. That's why general amnesty is so desired nowadays from the Democrats. That's why they brought in all these illegals, because they wanted to repeat the process that they did with Ronald Reagan, completely ignoring the fact that a lot of illegals back then, while, a bunch of them were criminals, actually all of them were criminals because they came into the country illegally, a lot of them were actually here for economic prosperity. They weren't here because they were actually, violent offenders. Now, MS-13 was here at the time, but they formed out of illegal immigrants that came here that were not actually part of a gang. MS-13, if you're not aware, actually formed inside the United States and then eventually went back to El Salvador. They were not an existing gang at the time, and that's when they became the horrible organization that we know of them today, where you cannot even get into it unless you have actually taken somebody out. But a lot of these policies that Ronald Reagan pushed for allowed a new group of individuals to come inside of the Republican Party. This included guys like George H.W. Bush, who pushed for more progressive policies, and they became known as the RINOs, the Republicans in name only. And then, as they grew with the Republican Party, they started to become part of what is known as the Uniparty. Now, the Uniparty is a kind of a misnomer to me, because it's not actually what people say it is. It's not the both parties coming together to rule the country behind the scenes and pretend that they are actually two different parties. The Uniparty is more like a group of individuals who agree basically along the same lines, and they will come together to push for policies that the American people may not necessarily want. Now, the Uniparty is sometimes not a bad thing, because sometimes you actually do want agreement between the two parties to push for certain policies that both parties desire. However, when these people in power come together to push for these policies, they're not always doing it because they actually care about what the people want. It's just that the people in power, who are already millionaires, want certain policies to benefit them. And since they've been voted into power, all they need to do is agree with each other, and then they can push whatever uh, policy that they desire without regards to what the people themselves want. And since the people voted all these representatives in, that means that you would have to overturn and overthrow, not overthrow, but, vote out every single individual who voted on these policies. And not everybody is going to be the same amount of upset about it in order to try to push this. Plus, these people are already rich and well connected. They have the funding from the super PACs that allow them to stay into office, but basically indefinitely. Now, this is definitely not something that the founding fathers really desired, but it is a huge issue with what's going on inside the country. Now, you might wonder exactly why there are RINOs, but there are not dinos. Like, why are there only Republicans in name only and not Democrats in name only? Well, the whole thing comes, again, kind of from propaganda that you would see on Wikipedia, for example. On Wikipedia, it specifically calls the Democrat Party a big tent party. Now, a big tent party is a party that involves, like, as many ideologies as humanly possible, allowing anybody and anybody, everybody and anybody, to come in to join the party, regardless of how extreme their views are. Now, that is slightly true. That is relatively correct, but it's not really. See, the party is actually controlled by the moderates, such as Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, and Joe Biden. Now, not much by Joe Biden anymore, but you understand what I mean. The guys that were more moderate actually control the party, and they are the ones who suppress, like, the votes of people like AOC, making sure that if AOC ever goes against the party line, against the moderates' position, that they will be pushed back into place, and that they will, their funding will be pulled from them. Now, McConnell has also done the same thing with other Republicans, that if the Republicans didn't do what McConnell wanted, he would use his influence over super PACs to make sure that they did not receive funding, and that they would be primaried out by people who were more willing to toe the party line. Now, this is the same kind of thing that Nancy Pelosi does, is that she will go and threaten other people in the party to make sure that they're actually doing what the moderates want them to do. So while there's propaganda that says that they are a big tent party, basically everyone is pigeonholed in this moderate stance. However, since they have to pretend that they're actually a big tent party, the more and more people step out of line, the harder it is to rein these people in, the more popular they get with their progressive base, the more difficult it is to actually threaten these people, because their districts are very progressive, and no matter how much you try to primary them, they'll never lose. For example, the Democrats tried to get rid of Sherry Thandar, the Indian representative of Detroit, and that failed miserably. They tried pushing for a black woman to replace the Indian man, saying that Sherry was not able to represent properly a black neighborhood. And again, absolutely 100% fell through and failed. Now, Mike Dugan, the mayor of Detroit, was the one who pushed for that. Now, while he doesn't have as much influence as someone like Chuck Schumer, who is desperately, by the way, Chuck Schumer is desperately trying to hold on to his position of power, but him going along with the Republicans for the continuous resolution really hurt his popularity amongst the moderates. This includes Nancy Pelosi, that are now pushing to have Chuck Schumer replaced. The problem is that replacing Chuck Schumer would mean that AOC would probably take his place. which that would be quite a thing if she was able to overthrow the longest serving or the most powerful man in the Senate. Now, yeah, again, I would say that he's the most powerful man in the Senate, even more powerful than McConnell. But McConnell also stepped down, so you know what I mean with that. He's getting out as well. But Chuck Schumer is quickly running up on his time to end his service as well, because he's just getting so old now. Nancy Pelosi also, God only knows if she's going to run. But the moderate Democrats are basically being replaced. And they're not being replaced by moderates. They're being replaced by progressives. Anyways, going back to the Republican Party and their whole issue. For the Republican Party, they decided that they would support basically anyone who got elected. For example, they had huge support for George W. Bush. Now, George W. Bush, while being, well, they call him an idiot, but he's not an idiot in any sense of the word. He's a pretty smart individual, but he a bit misguided, I believe, in my personal opinion, that he really wanted the push for the Iraq War, and which a lot of people disagreed with. And because Saddam Hussein had attacked Kuwait back in the day, and the United States never forgave him for that. It seems that the intelligence community really pushed for the war in Iraq to start off again and wanted Saddam Hussein overthrown. And they were told, like, George W. Bush was told that there were weapons of mass destruction there. And I think as a relatively naive man, he was actually convinced to go after Iraq, which turned out to be a huge mistake in the opinions of a lot of conservatives throughout the country. And it was also not very popular amongst the peace-loving liberals. Now, not every liberal is peace-loving. Antifa and BLM are huge examples of them not being peace-loving, but there were a lot of people who were not happy with the Iraq war. And there were also warmongers who don't like Israel on both mostly on the Democrat side, the Free Palestine crowd, who were not happy with the Iraq war because they really did not like the idea of Arab countries being overthrown and influenced by the United States. And you know what? Screw those guys. I understand it to an extent, but we're talking about guys like Hassan Piker now, who, outright have shown legitimate support for terrorist organizations. So I don't feel nearly as bad for those guys. Anyways, things like Romney, for example. Romney is a very RINO type individual. He was pushing for Romney Care, and this was supposed to be the counter to Obamacare. Romney was pushing for very left-wing policies, and the hope was that he would be left-wing enough to get the moderate vote. He didn't get it. He lost in a landslide because this is something that Republicans in general did not want, which is what we really mean when we're talking about RINOs, pushing for policies that the average Republican do not care for. Anyways, these policies really appealed to the working class man who was not getting health care through their job. They wanted stuff like Obamacare, and then later on it would turn out that Obamacare would take away the insurance that these people already had. Sometimes working class men were able to get insurance, and they were forced to get Obamacare, which was more expensive and covered for way, way less. This is why eventually that when Trump came in the political zeitgeist, that he got all of these working class men to support him instead, because he wanted to fix this system. Now, the reason why Trump, I mean, he would also be kind of considered a RINO, but not really because he pushes for a lot of populist policies. He is probably as liberal as like Ronald Reagan was, but he will not support a policy that he knows the people will not support. And since people remember the mass amnesty that Ronald Reagan gave out, he is definitely against that. And he knows that if he gave mass amnesty, he would make the same mistake that Ronald Reagan made. The problem with Trump is that he has more of a mouth on him. He's got more of that New York, like, angry, like, uh, pedestrian vibe that a lot of people don't like. But he is still just as nice and as kind as Ronald Reagan is, except he only is really like that when he's talking to you in person and you're treating him with respect. If you don't treat him with respect, he will not hesitate to call you a whole bunch of nasty stuff, which is why he has been like mistreated as much as he has, because he will actually lash out at people, unlike Ronald Reagan. But I think I'm going a little bit too far off the deep end there. That's another discussion for another time. So I'll leave it there, guys. Bye.